So we are looking at day one today of PFT 119, Kinesiology. So this is going to be, our information on the nervous system, which is sort of the command center for everything in the body, right? It's going to control your entire human movement. So for the next 3 days, we are going to be talking primarily about human movement and how we produce that human movement and the systems in our body that are responsible for that human movement. So that conversation has to start with the nervous system, because the nervous system is the command center. It's starting everything off. It controls everything, right? So we're going to be looking at that today as we go through this PowerPoint. If you have any questions, obviously go ahead and ask. But yeah, let's see. So purpose for today, we want to understand the fundamental concepts related to sort of the definition of different pieces of the nervous system, the structure of the nervous system, like how it's set up and structured, its function, how it sort of controls our human movement system. And then by understanding all of those, we will have hopefully a pretty good insight into how our body is actually operating. So our objectives today is to be able to kind of understand the basic structure and function of the overall nervous system and talk about how it responds and adapts to exercise when we start doing that. So before we actually do dive into the nervous system proper, we first got to talk about like a larger system. It helps to talk about it as a larger system. So we've got to talk about this big system called the kinetic chain, or the human movement system, right? So this system is what you're probably sort of like most familiar with, because it all kind of works together. When you just think about like your body moving, that's your human movement system, right? And what a system is, right? It's just several like pieces of something all coming together to work. Well, the human movement system's pieces are the skeletal system, which gives you a framework. If we were to sort of build like a person from, the inside out, right? We would start with the skeleton, right? And then we would sort of fill it up with muscles that can sort of move that skeleton around, right? We'd tie a muscle to this bone and then tie one to this bone. And then, whenever we pull that, it can move kind of like a puppet, and then the nervous system is going to be laid into all of that, threaded throughout the entire thing, and that's going to control that movement, right? So when we say the kinetic chain, or when we say the human movement system, right, what we're describing are these three interdependent, they rely on each other, systems that work together to produce movement, to produce and control human movement, right? So this is all about like talking about motion. Just like your cardiovascular system is responsible for pumping blood throughout your body, your respiratory system is responsible for gathering oxygen, but your cardiorespiratory system, which is the two of them together, it is responsible for doing both, right? It's like responsible for gathering oxygen and transmitting it throughout the body. And then we've got the human movement system, right? We've got all of these three independent systems. When they work together, that's the kinetic chain, and that's why we call it the kinetic chain, right? It's like chains linked together. And one of the other reasons we call it that is because we know that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and if one component of that link is not working effectively, it will affect the other components of the kinetic chain. If you have a skeletal dysfunction, let's say you just have a joint restriction, for instance, right? So actually, we can take a little survey here. Let's see if anybody actually has felt this. Does anybody when they're stretching their Achilles or like their soleus, or maybe sometimes even if you're stretching your gastrocnemius, like if you're doing like a big calf stretch, do you ever feel a pinching in the front of your ankle instead of a stretching in the back of your calf? Pinching in the front of the ankle. Anybody get that?
No.
Nope.
A lot of no's. That's good. I like to hear that. Because honestly, no's are easier to fix. But nobody? Not a single person in the call?
No.
That sounds odd.
What's that?
That sounds like pain.
Yeah. When I say pinching, it just kind of feels, I don't mean it's like really painful. It just kind of feels like bones hitting me. Like, I don't know, that's the end of my range of motion. Like I can't really like bend my fingers any closer to my palm. You know, it just kind of feels like it's stuck. That's what it kind of feels like. It's not like that painful, but it's like, I don't know, I'm just not going any further, you know? I'm hitting bone on bone, you know? Well, what that's called, we call that a joint restriction. And this can actually happen in a lot of different parts of the body. But a joint restriction is where you might have a tight muscle that gets so tight that it actually pulls your bone into a position that when it starts to move, eventually it gets to a range of motion that it just can't move any further. You're hitting bone on bone. So when we see like some severity in the tightness of the ankle, what starts to happen, and I'll show you what this looks like here. And this is what we're going to go over, like I said, next week when we get to the foot and ankle complex. But if you look at like your tibia and talus, this is called your tibio-talar joint, right? When you look at like how your tibia is coming, actually, that's great. How your tibia is coming down, it needs to be able to kind of, you know, slide along this, right? Like the talus needs to kind of, you know, it's hooked kind of like that. It needs to kind of be able to rotate like this through the joint hole, right? But if the muscles get really tight or really weak in certain areas, this shin bone can actually kind of slide down the talus a little bit and sit a little bit lower than it's supposed to. And then that joint doesn't have as much range of motion as it's supposed to get. So the way we fix that actually, let's see here, tibial resistance. If this Google's the way I wanted to. Yeah. So what you can do is you can take a resistance band and you place it right on that talus. And what that does, that kind of pulls the bone back a little bit. We call that distraction, by the way. You're distracting a bone because you're basically taking it and you're like, hey, you're in the wrong spot. You just kind of push it back to where it's supposed to go. And then you stretch. And what that allows you to do is get a deeper range of motion. Now, if you don't have a joint restriction, you're not going to feel anything when you do this. So if you guys end up goofing around with this and you're like, hey, that band thing didn't work for me. Well, you probably, I don't think anybody in here has like an ankle joint restriction. But if you have a client who's like stretching their calves or stretching every day and they're like, I don't know, my calves are just not getting any better, this could be your answer. So there it is, right? This is the kinetic chain, right? The skeletal system is sort of out of alignment and it's affecting how our muscular system can stretch. And then our nervous system, we're not even aware of it, right? We're like, I just thought that's how I move. And then, man, when you do this for someone, by the way, it's amazing. Like they'll squat and they'll go into a squat and they're like, oh my, I can get so low. They're like all the way like ass to grass. And it blows their mind because they're like, you know, normally whenever they squat low like that, they feel like they're going to fall forward because their ankle won't move. So their brain doesn't even know that they can move the way they're supposed to move, you know? And that's the interdependent nature of these three systems. So that conversation, that sort of set us up for the next 3 days here. So let's get our definitions out here because you may get tested on these, you know. They love definition questions. These are free points if you have them memorized, you know? But we got the nervous system. That's the command center of the kinetic chain, right? Oh, shoot. Actually, hold on. I got to make sure I'm not getting ahead of the PowerPoints. Yeah, no, I'm not. All right. So we got the nervous system. That's the command center of the kinetic chain, right? It's responsible for controlling everything, right? It's the head honcho. It's the CEO. It's making all the decisions. And then you've got your muscular system, which is sort of the workhorse that's doing most of the actual moving, right? So it's under the control of your nervous system, but it's responsible for actually like contracting and sort of dragging things around. Then you've got like the skeletal system, and the skeletal system is the overall like structure, right? It provides the framework that protects all of your delicate structures, and it also gives your muscular system the levers necessary to actually like move around, you know, like it gives your muscular system something to manipulate. So, you know, this is, like I said, like this is like the head of a company. This is sort of middle management here. And this is like all the factory workers, which are the freaking lifeblood of the entire human movement system. We need that skeletal system to give us a good structure so that our muscular system has something to manipulate and move around and, you know, and do. And then we need the nervous system to make sure that like we're not moving the way we're not supposed to, right? You know, they're there with like, it's like, hey, this is not in the budget. My analogy is breaking down. But so anyway, if one component of the kinetic chain is not working properly, it's going to affect the other components. So that's the human movement system. Now, obviously, we've got a bunch of systems inside the body that we as trainers like talk about, right? We talk about the cardiovascular system, respiratory system. We talk about metabolism, all that fun stuff. And, you know, a lot of you guys have already studied some of that, and we will definitely continue to study it. But in this course, we're pretty much going to spend all of our time just talking about movement, because we are talking about structural kinesiology. So what that is it's the study of muscles as they are involved in the science of movement. So I happen to be in the realm of personal trainers, more of an exercise science major. Instead, you know, a lot of trainers who have like degrees and stuff are generally like kinesiologists. That's like the thing they studied. So they're like, I studied kinesiology. But there is like the extra nerdy side of personal trainers who took a kinesiology class here and there, but primarily studied like exercise science, a little bit more on the metabolism side of things. And those are sort of like the two sort of sub pieces you'll see in the industry. We're going to study all of it, right? And we should study all of it. But like kinesiology is all about movement. So we're going to be a little bit less talking about metabolism in this course, even though it is a very important part of the conversation. That's something we'll kind of get into sort of in a couple modules. But for now, we are just looking at the study of movement. So the science here is all about like the angles by which like your joints should be able to move, right? Like, you know, like just yesterday, I was doing like lateral raises, right? And I've been doing lateral raises for years, you know, like this is a normal shoulder exercise that I'm very used to. And it popped into my head for just a second because I happened to do one rep where I was like, oh, that felt weird. And I got the little click, you know, I get the little shoulder click, right? The click. And you get people who get that all the time. They get like the constant clicking, right? And they think that it's just like, well, that's just how my shoulder is. It doesn't hurt. And honestly, if it doesn't hurt, you know, it's actually probably not hurting you, but it doesn't need to click. There is something just barely out of alignment. And so what you're feeling, that clicking, are little soft pieces of tissue that are basically rubbing against hard pieces of tissue. Kind of like a rubber band being dragged against something. Like if you had it stretched out and then it was, you know, you're rolling it over the counter or something. It's dragging. So, you know, I was like, oh crap, I did that rep wrong. And it was because I like went too far backwards, which gave me the click. And sure enough, like I even just did it right there, actually. And so what I needed to do, my next rep, all I did was just, you know, pull my shoulders back, but bring the dumbbells a half an inch forward. And there it goes, immediately gone. And I was able to do that thanks to my knowledge of kinesiology, right? I was able to make that adjustment on the fly because I know how the shoulder joint is supposed to move. So that's our goal. We're going to get you guys to know how every joint in the body is really designed to move. We got any questions so far, guys?
No, just taking notes.
Love it. I know we're in the philosophical portion. The lectures always start with me doing a lot of grandstanding and a lot of like philosophical stuff at first, but then once we're introed, we kind of dive into it. So, all right. So by definition, right, again, kinetic chain, coming with the word kinetic meaning forces and chain being a system that links together. We know that they all need to work together to manipulate movement. If one of them is out of alignment, well, all of them are out of alignment, you know? It's definitely going to affect the other ones. So we're going to start with the control system here. We're going to look at the nervous system. So by definition, our nervous system, like I said, we call it the command center up here, but the more scientific definition of it, right, is going to be a conglomeration of billions of cells specifically designed to provide a communication network within the body. So that's really the job here, right? Your nervous system is your communication network. And that seems kind of weird. You're like, communication network, you mean like almost like a bunch of phone calls, but that really is kind of how your nervous system works, actually. We are basically getting information to go away from the brain in order to like produce movement and do the stuff that we want to do. But then we've also got information coming back to the brain to let us know that stuff happened, or to let us know what is going on, right? Because here's the thing, right? This is I always ask people this, like, what is proprioception, right? So proprioception, your body's ability to understand where it is in space. We'll see that definition here in just a minute. That's information going away from the brain, but it's also information coming back to the brain. And so I always love to ask people this question, like if I put my hand behind my head and I can't see my hand anymore, how do I know I'm wiggling my fingers? Yeah. And somebody in a very basic answer would say, because you're the one telling your fingers to wiggle, right? And it's like, all right, well, I don't know about you, but there have been plenty of times in my life where I've told someone to do something and it didn't happen. Right? Like, so how do I know it's happening? That's the communication network, right? There's information going away saying wiggle, and there's information coming back saying, yeah, we're wiggling. So that's what our nervous system does. So definitely, one of the main organ systems inside of the body, probably definitely the most important of the organ systems. It's responsible for coordinating all the signals. It coordinates your digestive system, your nervous system, or your muscular system, your respiratory system, your cardiovascular system. It coordinates all of that. So when we look at the nervous system, we're going to divide it into two primary sections when we're studying it. So the two sort of primary components that we've got here is your central nervous system. That's your brain and your spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system. So you can think about like, the thing that's in the center, your spine is pretty much the dead center of you, right? Your brain, that's at the center of everything we do. And then you get the peripheral nervous system, which is all the stuff around the perimeter, right? It's all around the periphery. And so when we look at this, right, here's your central nervous system, right? The brain and spinal cord. This is where all the real decision making gets made, right? Central nervous system is mostly responsible for making all of your decisions. Whether it's conscious decisions that, your noggin's really thinking about, or it's unconscious decisions, like I'm really sore today, by the way, like, like I'm really kind of I'm feeling it today. And so like, in my chest in particular, my chest and shoulders. So if I were to like open my arms really rapidly, like you kind of notice, see how like my arms kind of bounced back naturally, and that because I felt kind of uncomfortable. So what that was is a stretch reflex. I took this muscle that really doesn't want to stretch right now because it's really sore, and I stretched it really rapidly. And then my nervous system was like, ow, and it pulled back without me wanting to. I didn't think about it. This is just something that happened naturally. That's an automatic response. So when you experience that automatic response, we call that a reflex. And reflexes are actually determined by your spine. They are very simple reactions to some type of extreme stimulus. So, even like Charlie, we were talking about getting shots earlier, right? When you get poked and you kind of jerk without even really thinking about it, a lot of times that's a reflex reaction. And so like what happens is information gets to the spine. And if that information is like normal information, then it'll travel up to the brain and the brain will go, oh, okay, let me think about that. This is the best response. And then it'll send a response back to wherever it's going. But if that information coming in is really extreme and the spine goes, oh, no, we don't have time to run this by the brain, it'll make a decision for you instantly. They're usually pretty raw. They're pretty simple, but sometimes they're pretty effective. This is, when somebody jumps out and scares you and you're like, that's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction. That's your spine sort of thinking for you without your brain, who's way too nerdy and takes forever to make a decision. It takes it out of that. So that's, like I said, both of those, doesn't matter though, whether it's a simple reaction or a very complex reaction. Either way, it's happening in the central central nervous system, right? That's your brain and your spinal cord. Now we need to be able to, so that's what we're seeing there. So we need to be able to kind of divide that up even a little bit further. In our next section, we have the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is all the peripheral stuff that's communicating, right? So, once the brain or the spinal cord makes a decision, it's got to get that information to the muscles that are totally far away from the brain. I mean, like, your brain's got to control your left pinky toe, which is pretty freaking far away. So luckily, it has the peripheral nervous system. So that will spread out through these peripheral nerves and tracts, getting to where it needs to go. And then it will recruit that muscle, or it'll sense information. So stuff travels from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, or it travels from the central nervous system to the peripheral. So it's either going towards the brain or away from the brain. And so those are our two primary components there. So before we kind of dive into, we've got a couple deeper components that we're going to see here in just a little bit. So talking about this idea of the communication network, right? Gathering information about our environments, both internal and external, and then interpreting that information. So, external interpretation, pretty easy to understand. If you touch a hot stove, right? Your brain goes, hey, that's pretty freaking hot. And then it makes a decision to remove your hand, right? But there's also internal stuff. When your blood becomes really acidic, for instance, your body will actually increase your heart rate in response. It'll increase your breathing rate because it goes, wow, there's too much lactic acid running through the blood right now. Clearly, we need some oxygen to convert that lactic acid into ATP. We talk about that in our metabolism classes. But that's that's like a sensory. If food gets into your stomach will start to make more stomach acid. But if your stomach is empty, it will make less stomach acid. So these are, some things we consciously think about, sometimes we don't consciously think about, but either way, all of that information has to go in 3 different functions. So our 3 primary functions are going to be sensory function, integrative function, and motor function. So sensory function is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or the external environment. So like I said, sensing a change in your stomach acid or your blood's pH, that's sensing information in the internal environment. Sorry, the street sweeping truck just went by. We don't have street sweeping on our street. They better not put those signs in, I swear to God. That's the best part of living here is no parking restrictions. Sorry. Back to class. So sensing changes internal or external. That's sensory. So, hold on. Hey, babe, can you do me a favor? Can you slap the mute button for me?
Okay.
And if you have a question, just unmute. You can ask questions whenever you want. Just want to make sure I don't get the reverb. Thank you. We don't need to hear 2 of me. Your nervous system sensing changes, right? That's sensory function. So its job is to sense the status of what something currently is. Like, is it hot? Is it sharp? Is it heavy, right? All of those things are sensory information. Picking up a heavy barbell. How does your body know how much muscle to recruit? That is your sensory function is going to determine that. So sensory function figures, it senses stuff. Integrative function takes that information and it runs it across all of your previous experiences in order to come up with the best response possible. So this is the ability of the nervous system to analyze and interpret that sensory information. This allows for proper decision making and producing the appropriate responses. So integrative function is where your body goes, okay, that is really sharp. Last time I touched something really sharp like that, it punctured the skin. And then we had to wear a Band-Aid and it was really annoying. And then when we took that Band-Aid off, it ripped all the hair. All right, well, we don't want to touch that sharp thing. So what it'll do is it'll instinctively move it'll then say, we should recruit muscles that will move the hand away. And that's where we'll start to dive into motor function here. But that is what your integrative function does. It runs information across past experiences to determine an appropriate response. You know, when I was a kid, my parents watched me. They did not protect me in this moment. Plug in my grandma's vacuum cleaner, and I held my thumb over the metal prong to like guide it in. I don't know. I was a little child. And so sure enough, I freaking connected the metal in between, and then my thumb was caught in there. And so I got a big electric jolt and it was like, Gah! And it shocked me and fell on my butt and started crying like crazy. And I did not plug stuff in that way anymore. That's, you know, integrative function. The next time I go to plug something in, my sensory function's going, okay, well, hey, we're going to plug this in, right? My integrative function's going to go, okay, don't do the dumb thing again. So its job, like I said, is to interpret the sensory information it's gathered. If something's really heavy, how much muscle should be recruited? If something's really hot, is it dangerously hot? Should we move the hand away? Right? These are questions that your integrative system's going to ask. And then motor function is pretty easy to understand. That's your nervous system's response to that sensory information based on the integrative decision that you made. So this is where your body goes, yeah, it's sharp. Move the hand. It's like, what muscles move the hand? The bicep. Boop. And then you do a little bit of elbow flexion, right? Or maybe it's like, yeah, that's really heavy. We're going to recruit all of these motor units, right? We're going to get all these muscle fibers firing. And then all of a sudden you recruit and boom, you get a big, strong, powerful contraction. So its job is to produce movement according to that integrative decision. If it's heavy, it'll recruit lots of muscle. If it's sharp, it'll pull your body in the opposite direction. So those are sort of the three primary functions of our nervous system. Now, all of that is coming together to make up what is probably the most important term of the day today. Like if you had to forget everything that I said, and please don't do that, but if you did, I'd say this is the one thing I'd have you remember, and that is proprioception. So proprioception is your body's ability to sense the relative position of adjacent body parts. You'll also hear this definition where it'll say it is the cumulative neural input from all sensory receptors throughout the body, which is great, but it's a big technical term that nobody, wants to repeat. Here's how I like to say it. It's your body's ability to understand where it is in space. So I had a teacher in school who, in order to highlight what proprioception meant, if you were not paying attention, if you were on your phone, or if you were just like doodling, or if you fell asleep, heaven forbid, and he would scream, he would go, proprioception, and then he would throw something at you. It was always something really gentle, but he had stuff hidden around the room. So he could throw stuff at any time. And if you heard that word, it meant look up and get ready to catch something that's flying at your face. And it was all, he was saying, very good. And if you would catch, you'd be like, very good proprioception, because you had very good, understanding of what's going on in the space around you. It's your body's spatial awareness, right? So proprioception is the information going away and the information coming back in that constant sort of communication. I'm sure somebody in here might have like one tight side and one loose side. So when you take your arms like up overhead, it might feel totally normal. Like you might have altered proprioception. You're like, oh, I feel like I'm raising these equally, right? And it looks pretty even here on camera, right? But if I move like this, do you guys notice how my left arm is much higher than my right? And did you also even think it can go much higher? So that's altered proprioception. Your body's saying, no, we couldn't possibly stretch any further. When in fact, you totally can. You've altered your proprioception. We are altering our proprioception every freaking day with these things. Like this stuff is just constantly causing this stuff, and that is altering our proprioception, pulling our heads forward, rounding our shoulders. And then that feels like normal posture, but it's not how we're really intended to move. So Proprioception is hugely important, right? This is mostly what we spend a lot of our time working on with our clients. We're trying to help our clients develop the appropriate proprioception. So, and what that does is it has really great effects. It improves your balance, it improves your coordination, it improves your posture, right? And it enables your body to adapt to its surrounding environment without having to think too much about it, because it can move the way it's really designed to move. So it's really important to train the nervous system properly with good form. This is one of the reasons why we harp on our clients about, doing things properly. I know sometimes like we can be a little picky about like, hey, like, you're doing great, but pull those shoulders back just a little bit. And it's like, really, the difference between this and this? And it's like, yeah, that little difference is huge. We're trying to develop the right type of movement patterns. So we know that all of that, right? Like, and the reason all this is true is like movement, right? When we look at movement, it's a response to your sensory information. So it reflects the importance of us, like making sure that sensory information is good, right? We want to make sure it's the right sensory information. This is why, like, I think this is why trainers can be so picky sometimes, or so opinionated. Good Lord, we are the most opinionated people on the freaking planet. Where it's like, no, that exercise is dumb. I get that approach. I understand it a lot of times, but like, because sometimes it's like, yeah, well, your body's not really designed to move that way. And now you're just getting into the kind of a bad habit, like, are you really going to hurt yourself by doing like a behind the neck pull? Probably not. But why would you train yourself to do more forward head posture? Like, why would you train more? Like, I'm not saying like a lat pull down behind the head is really going to kill you. It's honestly not that big a deal. Pushing behind your head, very bad for you.
I was about to ask you that, Brad.
Yeah, behind the neck pulls.
Like military press, like on behind your head. Is that bad?
Oh, that one's really bad. So pulling is not as dangerous, although like I said, I'm clearly not a fan. But pushing behind the head, avoid that at all costs, because that's putting your shoulder joint in a closed packed position, and it's all just like locked together, and then you can't move your scapula the way you're supposed to. So you end up recruiting like this big heavy weight with these big muscles that can keep up, and then little muscles that normally wouldn't have to like do too much work. Suddenly they are all way overworked. So you're just asking for like a sprained something.
No matter the range of motion, right? So it's overall it's just bad.
Yeah, I'm really not a fan of any pressing from a closed back position. Yeah, personally. But pulling, not that bad. But it's dumb because we don't need any more of this. I don't know a single client. I don't have a single client who has, too little of this. So why train for it? So that's the kind of habits that we kind of want to make sure we're getting our clients in, right? This is, again, why good form is so important. All right, any questions so far? We're about to move into the anatomy portion. Any question? That's all the sort of functional stuff. Questions, comments, concerns? All righty. So let's go ahead and zoom in on the nervous system here. Let's understand our anatomy. What makes up our nervous system? Well, a bunch of neurons, right? So the neuron, we call it the functional unit of the nervous system, meaning that it's what makes up your nervous system, right? It's billions and billions and billions of neurons. You get more neurons in your body than we can see with the naked eye, stars in the sky. So you've got a lot of them. And so when we look at them, and we look at their sort of, structure here, they're just like any other cell inside the body. They got a nucleus, just like a lot of cells do. They've got little mitochondria inside of them so they can produce energy. They got lysosomes to keep themselves healthy, ribosomes to assemble their DNA and make them look a certain way. They've got all the normal stuff you're going to see inside of a cell, but they've also got a couple special characteristics here, one of which is this big long tail here. And this big long tail makes the nervous system really good at being a communication network, right? Because this long thing can be tied to that long thing, which can be tied to that long thing and that one. And then if you feel this one, move, well, it can affect maybe the other ones, kind of like a spider web, right? If you pull, on one part of a spider web, it's going to make all of them sort of vibrate. And now we know exactly, sort of where that's coming from. It's a network. It's all connected. So axons allow that to happen because all of your neurons have these big long tails on them. But they've also got these little fingers that branch off from the cell body. Those are called your dendrites, which is actually Greek for tree, by the way, because they kind of look like the branches of a tree. And your dendrites are going to actually link up with the axons of other neurons, or maybe those dendrites are going to link up with maybe, some other type of tissue. So now we can start to see like how we've got like one side connected to the other. This is like a male and a female port on some type of cord that you have, like you plug that one in that way, you plug that one in that way. And there we go, right? Those are sort of the structure of that. Those are how our neurons are sort of shaped. And then you can also see there's some other special stuff here. These little interesting little like beads that are kind of covering it. It's called your myelin. And so myelin is this little thing. And when your nerves are creating these like electrochemical signals that are sort of traveling throughout them, that myelin protects that electric signal to make sure that it doesn't get lost. So if I was like zapping something, maybe from here, and then it traveled over here and then down, and then suddenly it got to this neuron here, into the cell body, and then start traveling down the axon. I don't want that signal to get lost, so I want it to continue traveling. Multiple sclerosis, for anybody who's ever heard of the MS, that's a disease in which the immune system, for some reason, eats away the myelin. And so what you'll see is like people with multiple sclerosis will have really bad balance. Sometimes it'll look as if they're having like muscle spasms, and they kind of just move like kind of unpredictably. They do a lot of like accessory movement that they have a hard time kind of keeping. And the reason for that is because like they might lose, their muscle might stop contracting because it was supposed to get a signal from the brain that says like, yeah, squeeze. But then that signal got interrupted because it got lost halfway through the axon of some neuron. And there's really no cure for that disease currently, although personal trainers, we have a really positive impact on clients with MS because we may not be able to get their their nervous system fixed, but what we can do is improve their general balance and coordination. So if their muscle does give out on them, they'll be able to catch themselves more effectively. And that is a huge quality of life improvement, and something we will talk about in our next course, PFT 106, Special Populations. That's called foreshadowing. All right. So we got a bunch of different types of neurons throughout the body, right? They're all structured to look pretty similar to each other, but what they do is very different. So you'll notice actually this is going to look pretty familiar because this is the same organization that we saw in our nervous function, right? We've got sensory function where we sense stuff, integrative function where we decide stuff, and motor function where we move stuff, right? Well, you've got neurons that are responsible for all those things. You've got sensory neurons, and sensory neurons transmit what we call afferent nerve impulses from a receptor site to the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so sensory neurons are going to gather information from outside the body and get it to the brain, right? So sensory information is going towards your central nervous system. Now, like I said, if that sensory information is really intense, your spine will make a decision instantly. But if it's not so intense, it'll go up to your brain, and your brain will go, the best decision is probably, yeah, and it'll be all nerdy about it. Of course, that doesn't happen as slowly as I just described it. Happens at the friggin' speed of light. But that's your sensory information, okay? Now, that is called an afferent nerve impulse. here's what sucks about studying the nervous system. And I want to apologize on behalf of the entire anatomy and physiology community. The other version of impulses, which is exactly the opposite, are your efferent nerve impulses, or efferent, if you want to say it that way. Afferent and efferent, they sound exactly the same. It's very confusing. But it's kind of like the difference between affect and effect, right? And effect. Like I am affected by something, or I have an emotional effect on someone. So there's the difference here. The much easier way to remember this is to memorize the direction that they're going. Sensory neurons are going from the neuron to the brain. Motor neurons are efferent nerve impulses from the brain or the spinal cord to an effector site, such as a muscle or an organ. So this one's going from the brain to your muscles, your organs, whatever, glands, right? All throughout your entire body. So again, sensory neurons might tell you that this coffee mug is, 1,000 degrees, right? And then motor neurons are going to recruit muscles in my wrist to open up my palm and drop that freaking hot coffee mug, right? So a sensory or afferent impulse comes in, and a motor efferent impulse goes out. And then obviously we've got to be able to connect our nervous system to our muscular system, which is not exactly close, it is very far away. And so because of that, because it's very far away, we've got to be able to connect from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron. And those are what we call our interneurons, and they transmit impulses from one to another. So sensory information goes from a sensory neuron to the brain. Motor neurons go from the brain to the motor neurons, and interneurons are from neuron to neuron to neuron. Any questions on that, guys? This coffee is not 1,000 degrees, by the way. It is actually ice cold. As I never drink my coffee fast enough. Any questions there at all? Okay, so for the record, for today's reading, this is what's kind of cool about these PowerPoints. They've kind of got everything sort of mixed into the PowerPoint itself, so it shows you what pages. So your homework today is to read your Trail Guide to Movement, pages 141 through 142, and your regular NASM textbook, pages 18 through 19. Babe, do you have a question?
Yeah. Right, if you can explain the sensory neurons again. I understand that you mentioned something about going out, the afferent, the sensory, let me see, hold on, let me go back to my notes.
Sure.
The sensory neuron, which the brain is telling you what movement to do, and then what is the motor. Hang on, let me go back to those.
You just got them barely flipped.
I'm sorry?
You've got them just slightly flipped. So,
okay.
So a sensory neuron is going to be located in like my palm, right? So I'll have like sensory neurons. And by the way, you actually have, your palm's a really good example, because these are some of the most sensitive neurons you've got in your body, and you've got big clusters of sensory neurons in our palms, more densely packed into our palm than anywhere else in the body, actually, which is why, like if you were to, this is going to be very weird for me to do, but if I were to like rub my cheek on this like little sticker that I have here, right? I wouldn't be able to really distinguish what I'm looking at. But if I were to run my thumb or like my palm over it, I would know kind of what I'm sensing, because I've got more sensory neurons in my palm than most other places in the body. Your bottom of your feet as well. And so those sensory neurons, they're sending out what's called an afferent impulse, and it's an impulse that's going to go to the brain. So my brain's going to get the information from my palm, right? That's a sensory neuron. So if it's going from here up to my brain, that's a sensory neuron. But if my brain sends a signal back, that would be a motor neuron. A motor neuron is going to send the information in response to my
Back to the
sensory
brain.
information after it comes from the brain. Yep.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, actually we can take a look at that if I show you like a reflex arc. Here's a little picture that'll kind of describe this, right? Oh, can I get a better picture? I don't hate this. I just want to make sure it's, I just want one that's not pixelated. There we go. All right. So right here, we've got a receptor, right? This is a sensory neuron touching a hot object. So he's touching this flame here, right? And what's going to happen is that's going to travel from the sensory receptors that are maybe in like this, the tip of this finger. And then it's going to travel from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron all the way up his arm. So that's through his peripheral nervous system. And then it's going to finally get to his central nervous system. So this is his spine right here. It's sort of a top-down look of one of our spinal discs. And then it's suddenly reached the central nervous system. Now, if it's not that hot, that signal is going to travel up to the brain. The brain's going to think about removing it. But if the signal's really hot, then the spine is going to make a decision right now before it even travels up to the brain. And so now that decision is going to travel down different neurons, and they're going to go to recruit whatever muscle is going to move that hand away, right? So these are your efferent or efferent impulses. This is going to travel from here, and it goes, okay, the best way to save that finger is to recruit the biceps muscle, and then it moves.
Moves out. Yeah.
Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Cool. And that happens everywhere. That's an extreme example, you know, but it's literally happening to every piece of information constantly. Crazy, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like how many little pieces of sensory information we're experiencing all day, it starts to really make a lot of sense why we as humans like deal with things like decision fatigue, or we get like sensory overloaded. You know, like you'll see it, you know, go to Disneyland, right? Kids are like, this is amazing. And there's stuff everywhere. And then by like the end of the day, their brains are just like, ah, there's just too much sensory information. Your brain's trying to respond to all of it, you know? I say kids, but I get like that sometimes. I'm like, by the end of the day, I'm just like, I feel great. This is the best day ever, but I gotta go home. All right. So let's go ahead and divide our neuron down real quick, divide our nervous system down into sections here. So we got a couple different sections that are each going to do sort of different things. So this is a little bit less talking about like the anatomy of things, even though we're sort of labeling it. There's a little bit less about anatomy. There's a little bit more about like the function, right? So we kind of want to understand like what parts of our nervous system are under the control of like what parts of our nervous system. Let me explain. So you've got the central system, right? That's your brain and your spinal cord. Like I said, its primary function is to coordinate all of your activity. It's interpreting sensory information. Hey, that's dangerous, or no, that's a puppy, that's fine, right? Like, and then it's sending out information in response, right? It's like, that's dangerous, that's a shark, go that way, right? That's fine, that's a puppy, you know, proceed, you know, proceed without caution. This, by the way, and there's stuff in your brain that you aren't even necessarily fully aware of. Like me, I am not so much afraid of spiders. It's never been something that really bothers me, but I am absolutely terrified of bees. They are just the scariest thing in the world to me. It's the one that's literally my greatest fear is bees, which is very silly, but that is sort of a response. And I'm sure it's because I probably got stung when I was a little kid and my central nervous system just logged that information away, and I've just kept it in my brain forever. And it's just stuck there, you know? Other people, spiders, they probably have something in the back of their brain that goes, yeah, that thing is dangerous, you know, step away. That's your sensory, that's your central nervous system, right? Central nervous system is in charge of all the decision making. Your peripheral nervous system does all the work that your central nervous system tells it to do, right? So your central nervous system makes a decision to bend your elbow, and the peripheral nerves that control that bicep muscle are the ones that are going to recruit it. So my brain made the decision, but my peripheral nervous system sent the information to where it needed to go. Okay, so big wordy PowerPoint slide here, but it consists of the nerves that connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. This includes your sensory receptors. And that's the thing about the peripheral nervous system, right? Stuff has to travel in both directions. It's like a highway. You know, you've got a northbound and a southbound. Northbound's probably going to the brain, but the southbound's going to your quad muscles or your glutes or whatever. And so it's going to provide the connection between those two systems. This is why when you see someone who's like a paraplegic, right, what has happened is they have severed the connection. Like maybe they've broken this specific part of their spinal column, and they've severed the correct connection between their peripheral nervous system and their central nervous system. And what's crazy is like they can still get those muscles to contract if they use like an external like machine, like an e-stim machine or something. Even in a paraplegic, you can get their muscles to contract. Their muscles still have that ability. Their neurons are still there, but there's no connection between the central system and the peripheral system. So unfortunately, their brain cannot hear the leg, or vice versa. Now that peripheral nervous system, this is going to divide into two primary sections. So this is where we're going to kind of draw a chart here. So we've got, like I said, we've got the central nervous system. And we have got our peripheral nervous system. And they work together, right? Like they are totally connected together. So we'll kind of connect them here. Now that peripheral system is going to divide into two primary sections. It is going to divide into the two types of decisions that you make every single day, even if you aren't fully aware of it. So some of those decisions that you're making are conscious ones, right? Like you're deciding to do specific things. And some of those decisions are unconscious ones, right? Like if I am instinctively afraid of bees, right? I don't really have very much control over that, but I do have control over my ability to squeeze my glute muscles and run that way. So your peripheral nervous system is going to divide into your somatic and your autonomic. Okay, so the somatic part of your nervous system is your voluntary conscious control. Okay, that is the part of your nervous system that you choose to recruit and like have control over, right? So when I decide to like bob my head side to side like this, that is my somatic nervous system that's doing it. My central nervous system makes the decision. It sends the information down my peripheral nervous system, which travels to my somatic muscles in the my upper trapezius to tilt my head side to side like this. But what if you start to tell me, that there's something hiding in my closet, like some monster in there. And it's like, there's something in there. It's a surprise. It's going to scare the crap out of you. And I'm like, what? And it sounds very nerve wracking, right? And I start to get very nervous. Well, then my heart rate might start increasing, right? And that's going to be my autonomic nervous system. Or you can think of this as involuntary. So that's your involuntary nervous system. This is the stuff you don't have control over. This is the stuff you unconsciously sort of don't think about, but just happens, right? Like, I had my breakfast earlier. And right now, my digestive system is squeezing that food through and, getting it from place to place to place to place to place until eventually it works its way outside the body, right? Thank goodness we don't have to constantly think about that, right? That's our autonomic nervous system that's kind of controlling that. So it's still under the control of the brain. We just don't have to voluntarily think about controlling it. Your heart rate is involuntary. That's a really good example. Your muscles are voluntary. They are the stuff you are choosing to do. So your somatic nervous system is the section of the nervous system responsible for voluntary control. And your autonomic nervous system is responsible for involuntary control. Pretty clear on that so far, guys? All right, we got one more division. So now when it comes to involuntary stuff that we can't control, we have two further divisions. We are going to divide that down into our sympathetic nervous system, which is more commonly referred to as your fight or flight system. So your sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that's like, oh, God, right? You start sweating, your heart rate starts racing a little bit, right? That's your sympathetic nervous system at play. So that's the involuntary stuff. This is why panic attacks, sometimes people have such a hard time controlling themselves, right? When they have like a panic attack, they start hyperventilating. It's like, hey, calm down. Yeah, that's not going to help. Telling them to calm down, because it's an autonomic reaction. They're involuntarily responding to this thing that's making them nervous, right? Now, like I said, your heart rate is involuntary, but you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, like I know how to control my heart rate, right? Like you can slow your heart rate down. Maybe you're like margaritas on the beach, or like a handful of kittens. You're thinking really calming thoughts, like sitting in a tree reading my favorite book, like whatever, right? Whatever, like happy, calm thoughts. And maybe that slows your heart rate down because then you become less nervous. So it's like, hey, didn't I control my heart rate? Kind of, right? Like you controlled things that you can control that had an effect on your heart rate. But that would be like me saying, yeah, I can control my heart rate. And then I sat down, right? Like me sitting down means I'm recruiting less muscle, which means my heart doesn't have to work as hard, right? But I didn't go slow down heart. I can't consciously control my heartbeat. That is going to be autonomic. Now, if that heart rate speeds up, that's a fight or flight response. That's my sympathetic nervous system. And if my heart rate slows down, that is my parasympathetic nervous system. And that is the more commonly referred to as the rest and digest system. So this is the one that's sort of really kind of relaxing you and calming you down, getting you back to normal, right? So these are sort of the divisions of our nervous system, right? They get the decision maker right over here. We've got the sort of relay information, like the post office, right? Like sending information either to the decision maker or to the workers, right? And then that information's either going to conscious voluntary control, or it's going to unconscious involuntary control. And that involuntary control is either going to pick things up faster or slow things down. So your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Sympathetic is the fight or flight. It's responsible for your heart rate, your breathing rate, your sweating. It increases all your metabolic responses. So even just like when your room gets hot, right, and you start sweating a little bit, that's autonomic. And it's actually sympathetic. That's your nervous system going, oh man, we're a little hot. And it, amps up a system. Parasympathetic is going to roll back a system. Say like, you know what, temperature's normal, we feel great. Let's bring that temperature back to neutral, right? And that's your rest and digest system. So when you you know, you've probably experienced this plenty of times when you've been driving, especially here in LA. I know I experienced this. You get cut off, or maybe somebody swerves out of their lane and almost hits you or something, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, what a freaking jerk. And then you're kind of mad, you're scared, right? Like, you get all these like negative emotions and your adrenaline's pumping like crazy. And like you're sitting there and you're like, I'm fine. And then like 10 minutes later, you're like, God, no, I'm not. I can't believe that guy did that. You know, like you're still kind of upset about it. The reason you're still kind of upset about that is because your fight or flight system made a whole bunch of hormones that are running throughout your body to amp up your body system. So you're in like, you know, either sprint that direction mode or go punch something mode. And you're just stuck that way until eventually your parasympathetic nervous system is able to kind of calm you down and make anti-hormones, you know? Which is where you'll see people, you know, sort of be disarmed sometimes. They might be in like a really big sympathetic thing, and then somebody will just give them a hug, you know, and it's like, hey, relax, and give them a hug, and they're like, okay, yeah, I feel better. You know, it kind of makes you rest and digest stuff because it calms you down. It sort of makes the anti-stress hormones. So those are sort of the divisions of our nervous system there, right? Any questions on that so far, guys? How are we feeling on that?
I'm good, bro.
Cool, cool. We've definitely talked about this before. Bay, how are you feeling?
I'm good.
Cool. All right. So this information, by the way, is also, you can see this picks up, you know, 18 through, where you see page 20 in your regular textbook, or in your trail guide, page 138 through 140. Somewhere in those sections is where you're going to get everything we just talked about. All right, so last little bit here. Let's finish up the nervous system today. I would say, again, you know, I talked about how proprioception is the most important thing of today's lesson. I'd say remember your proprioception. Well, this is going to fall under that same category. So sensory receptors are what give us our proprioception. So what the heck are sensory receptors, right? We talked about like in the palm, right? The little nerves in your palm. Those are your sensory receptors. So they are specialized structures that are located throughout the body that transform environmental stimuli. So environmental stimuli could be the heat of something. It could be how much light there is, the sound of it, like the vibrations, pressure, right? Stretching sensations, right? Any of those things, even just simple motion, right? And it takes all that stimuli and it converts it into sensory information. And then that sensory information can be interpreted by your brain or your spinal cord, right? It can be interpreted. So these are special structures that basically sense information, right? So like you've got like nociceptors, right? Nociceptors are pain receptors. They're actually kind of unique. They don't even kick on until you hit like a certain threshold. And that's where, you know, you probably experienced that, where you're like, that's fine. Okay, that freaking hurts, right? Like, and that's all of a sudden your nociceptors kind of kicked on. You've got chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are kind of cool. Your taste buds are chemoreceptors. They sense chemical changes. So when something's really salty, it transmits that information to the brain. When something's really sweet, it transmits that information to the brain. Or when something looks like it should be really sweet, like an artificial sweetener. That's a man-made chemical that is shaped super similarly to sugar, but doesn't actually have any calories in it. So your brain gets the sensory information saying, yeah, that's sweet, even though it totally actually isn't, not in real life. There's no actual sugar there. Not a fan of artificial sweeteners, by the way, just using them as an example. We've got photoreceptors. Photoreceptors respond to different like wavelengths of light. So, you know, light is just a bunch of waves. And so that is what tells us what color something is, you know, the little receptors in our eyeballs. So you've got a lot of different types of sensory receptors that are going to go towards the brain. The big one we're going to spend our time talking about are going to be the mechanoreceptors. So mechano, think like mechanical, right? Like physical. And these are sensory receptors that sense mechanical changes, things like touch, or maybe like pressure, or stretching, right? All of that information goes to the brain thanks to our sensory receptors. So the big ones that we're going to talk about, and I know you guys have been over this, you guys are getting familiar with these for sure. The big ones, the big mechanoreceptors that we spend a lot of time talking about are going to be our muscle spindles, our Golgi tendon organs, and our joint receptors. So muscle spindles are mechanoreceptors that sense the changes in the length of a muscle and the rate of that length change. So if I show you like a muscle spindle here, if you take a look at it, it basically runs the length of our muscle. That's a good picture there, but it's sort of embedded in the muscle and it wraps itself around our muscle fibers. And when you relax your muscle, the little spring senses that. It goes, oh, okay, we're in a relaxed position. But then when it contracts your muscle, right, and then that's causing like a shortening sensation, that's going to send a signal to the brain. Or let's say you're doing the opposite. Let's say you're stretching a muscle out, right? That's going to send a signal to the brain saying, whoa, and your spring's getting pulled apart, right? It's getting stretched out. So these are the sensory receptors that are, from your nervous system that are running throughout your muscular system. And this is, again, how we have proprioception. So go back to my example earlier, right? How do I know I'm wiggling my fingers? Well, when I move this finger like this, there is a muscle spindle that's sending a signal to my brain saying, hey, I'm at this length, right? And the brain goes, oh, okay. And then there's another muscle spindle that's saying, yeah, and I'm at this length, right? And the brain goes, okay, well, if you're at that length and you're at that length, then the hand is in this position. And then all of a sudden I change it. And now suddenly like this one's saying this and this one's saying that, right? So that is sort of like how that sensory information works. It's all coming up to the brain. If I told you that I've got a box and in that box is an object with 3 sides, all at equal angles, and it's very pointy, you should all be picturing like a triangle, right? Like I gave you a couple pieces of information, you were able to put it together. Well, that's exactly what sensory receptors do. They give your brain pieces of information and your brain pieces it all together and goes, oh, okay, we're in this position or this position or this position or this position, right? That's what a muscle spindle does. So they are sensitive to changes in the length of a muscle, and they're also sensitive to the rate of that change. So if you change the length really rapidly, the signal is going to be really intense. And remember, when a signal is really intense, it doesn't even get up to the brain. It gets to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord goes, oh, pull back the other way. That's what we actually call a stretch reflex. So when you overly stretch something really rapidly, right? If I can move my hands all the way back here, right? You can see like how much further that's kind of going back beyond me. But if I go like this, and I just let this relax for just a second, and I try to move this really freaking fast, I might get like an even further stretch, but you'll notice I will spring back naturally. Right? That looked very intentional, but you can even see it like, if I'm not trying to even bounce back, it happens without me even having to think about it. Now, you probably are more familiar with the classic example of a stretch reflex. If you think of the knee-jerk reaction, right? So if you've ever been to the doctor's office and they tested your reflex where you stand there, you sit there on the table and they take that little hammer and they go, and then your knee kicks forward like that, right? What they're doing is they are smacking this little thing called your patellar tendon. They are smacking this little sensory receptor right here. And that tricks your brain into thinking that you just stretched your quad muscle like crazy. It thinks that, you're tricking your brain into thinking that you basically went like this, but not just like this, like freaking that, like just ripped it. And so your brain went, whoa, and then in order to protect itself, it contracted that muscle. And that's a reactive response. That's your body going, no, don't overly stretch the muscle. You're tearing in half, So muscle spindles are going to sense the length of things. Now, this is a protective mechanism, right? You know, that stretch reflex, that's a protective mechanism that keeps us nice and safe. Now, if you've got something that's going to sense how long something is, we've also got to have something that senses how much tension something has. And so this is actually what's going to get smacked in our knee-jerk reaction. So your Golgi tendon organ is a mechanoreceptor, just like the muscle spindle was, that senses the change in your muscle's tension and the rate of that tension change. So if a muscle spindle was saying how long something is, a GTO, a Golgi tendon organ, is going to tell your body, your brain, how much tension is in something. So here's how all of your muscles are sort of arranged, right? They all, you know, they all end in like a muscle that sort of ends in a tendon, and then that tendon grabs onto a bone. But, you know, just like your grip, right? Like if you were holding on to something, like if you were holding on to something and somebody else was like pulling you and you were trying to like, they were like, you know, you're pulling, eventually you're gonna lose your grip, you know, like, and then you lose your grip, right? Well, that's sort of what a Golgi tendon organ is doing, right? It's there to tell your brain how good of a grip it has on your bones, because we never wanted to get to a place where, there we can see like a tendon tear, you know, that's what a pulled muscle is, right? Is you tore a tendon. So these Golgi tendon organs live in this receptor right here. And when that tendon's stretched like crazy, it's sending a signal to the brain saying, hey, tension's getting pretty high. Maybe don't stretch any further, right? Or if you smack it with a hammer, right, it again thinks that you are overstretching your quad. So it's going to try to protect itself by contracting. So this is located in the tendons. So your muscle spindles are located in the muscles. Your Golgi tendon organs are located in your tendons. And what's kind of cool is Golgi tendon organs, like I said, they sense tension. So here's what's interesting, and I know we've talked about this before, but this is sort of one of the most common ways to kind of describe how flexibility training works. When you think about like stretching, when you think about like improving your mobility and stretching out, right? You start like stretching a muscle, you're like, oh God, that's tender. You know, you're like stretching, like, oh, it's so tight, you know, and then all of a sudden after you hold it for about 30 seconds, kind of starts to relax. You're like, oh my gosh, I got way more range of motion, right? You know, like that's like me if I try to touch my friggin' toes because I got really tight hamstrings, right? And as I go down, I'm like, ooh, that's tight, right? That's a lot of tension. But then after about 30 seconds, I'm like, well, I can totally go further, you know? What starts to happen is the muscle spindle, which is sensing the length, it's kind of freaking out, you know? It's like, hey, we're being lengthened. And if we get too long, we'll tear, right? But you've also got a Golgi tendon organ, which is there to sense tension. So if you've got an overactive muscle spindle that's like, you know, really sensitive and it's just telling the brain like, no, don't stretch any further. We're going to tear, we're going to tear, we're going to tear, we're going to tear. It's freaking out, right? Like, but then you hold that stretch for like 30 seconds and then all of a sudden the Golgi tendon organ's like, yeah, no, we're fine. I got a great grip over here. I'm not going to lose grip anytime soon. There's no tension. Well, then your brain starts to realize, well, then the muscle must not be at that long. So then it will actually tell the muscle to relax further. And then that muscle spindle will let go. It'll be inhibited, actually. It'll turn it off. And that will allow you to stretch to a further length. And this is why we foam roll for a minimum of like 30 seconds. It's why we static stretch for a minimum of 30 seconds, because we need to give our nervous system time to realize that our Golgi tendon organs have very, very little tension. And then that Golgi tendon organ can basically tell that muscle spindle to shut up. It's like, hey man, stop freaking out. We're fine. I got a great grip over here, you know? But you have to do it slowly. And you have to do it for a full 30 seconds. That process, by the way, is called autogenic inhibition. We'll talk more about it in later classes, but that is sort of what we use to put pressure on like a Golgi tendon organ, which allows your brain to realize that your muscle spindle is a big that liar. And then our last type of sensory receptor that we're going to talk about are our joint receptors. And joint receptors are located in your joints. Shocker, I know. And their job is to sense pressure within the joint, acceleration, deceleration, and, you know, like I said, the tension within your joints. So when you experience like a lot of pressure in your joints, because maybe something's like really heavy, or maybe you're already fully extended, right? Your joint receptors are going to feel that. So like, even if you just like everybody just straighten your elbow and you just really try to lock that elbow out, and you start to get that like, ow, it feels like bones grinding on bone. Yeah, that's your joint receptors. Your joint receptors are going, hey, yeah, we're already maxed out here. Stop grinding us together, you know? But they're also there to sense like accelerating, decelerating, and that's further sending information to the brain. So when I am moving my elbow like this, right, I know that there are like slight pressure and accelerating and decelerating changes coming from my elbow. Meanwhile, this bicep muscle is shortening and then lengthening, and then my tricep muscle is shortening and lengthening. So if my bicep muscle is 50% contracted, my tricep muscle is 50% contracted, and this is experiencing some acceleration, well, then my brain knows that I am performing elbow flexion. And that is exactly how these mechanoreceptors give us proprioception, our body's spatial awareness. So here's what's cool, guys. Early improvements in physical activity, like when your client first starts training, they're going to get stronger and they're going to get more coordinated right away. But most of that is because of their nervous system. Their nervous system is going to get better at doing the movements. Your nervous system can adapt fairly quickly to things, which is, again, why we need to train with good form from day one. So you're going to see this in your trail guide and in your NASM. So you guys are going to read, I think, 19 through 22 and 150 through, that's not right, 150 through 1. Okay, yeah, no. I was like, that's too many pages. 141 through 140, and then you'll pick up that trail guide further at 152 to 157. So about 7 or 8 pages to read today. It shouldn't be too bad. Yeah, let's go ahead and summarize everything up. So our 3 components of the kinetic chain, right? Nervous system, muscular system, skeletal system. Our nervous system, which we talked about today, is our communication network that's responsible for sensing information, interpreting that information, and executing a motor response. And we use sensory neurons to gather that information. We use motor neurons to execute the response information. And we use interneurons to connect the different parts of our nervous system. You have got your central, which is in charge of decision making, your peripheral, which is in charge of sort of carrying out the decisions that got made. And then that peripheral is going to divide into conscious, somatic, voluntary responses, or unconscious, autonomic, involuntary responses. And then those involuntary responses can either be sympathetic, which means they're going to amp things up and freak out, or parasympathetic, which means they're going to slow things down and calm the system. And then we've got all of our different, the mechanoreceptors in particular, the ones we're going to spend our time talking about. Muscle spindles sense the length of your muscles. Golgi tendon organs sense the tension within your tendon, so the tension of your muscles. And then joint receptors sense the accelerating or decelerating, or how much pressure is within your joints. And that is about it for today, guys. Any questions here at the end? Comments or concerns?
Just to review the reading for today.
Yeah. It's back on, actually.
So we're gonna read, you mentioned 140 or 141, 152.
Yeah, and so in the Trail Guide to Movement, it's this one right here. This book. I'm actually not sure. I think you guys have this cover now, right? They change the cover every freaking day. But the one that's called the Trail Guide to Movement, that's the one. That's the one we want. And you're going to be pages like 152 to 157, or pages and pages 141. Sorry, 138 through 141.
138 to 141. Okay, that's the one.
Yep. Yeah.
Mentioned, page 18 and 19, is that same book?
That one's in your regular NASM. So then in your regular textbook, this one, you are going to do pages, where did it go? 18 through 20.
20, okay.
Oh, sorry, 18 through 22.
22. Oh. That's the NASM. Okay.
So, and then Bay, I'm going to go ahead and hold on to you for just a minute. I'm going to let everybody else out of here. And then I want to walk you through how to use Canvas and stuff. And then how our daily emails work and stuff. Any other questions today, guys?
All good, Brad. Thank you.
All right, fellas. I will see everybody tomorrow.
All right. See you tomorrow, Brad.
See ya. Oh, I need to stop the recording.